one of the most delicious and basic foods that we all can eat and really enjoy, that has a huge variety of taste and quality, is bread and butter. So today we're going to make our own bread and butter. First of all, we're going to start off using organic cream to make our own butter. And you may think I'm crazy, but one day I had this experience of going to a restaurant where, along with the crusty fresh bread, they gave me this little tiny pat of house-made butter. Well, that stuff was so delicious, and no matter what butter I bought at the supermarket, it never seemed to taste the same. So I decided to try and make my own butter, a thing that humans have been doing for an awfully long time. And I found, with the addition of this machine, mixer, it was very easy. So I'm going to show you how to make house-made, organic, spreadable from the fridge, delicious as you'd get in any of the finest restaurants in the world, butter with some really good bread. So there are two attachments which usually come with the mixer, the whisk and the beater, and then we're going to use both of those today. The first one we're going to use is going to be the whisk. So butter has had a very maligned history over the last 20 or 30 years as a saturated fat, an animal fat that's solid at room temperature. It was really found from studies to be associated with giving people higher cholesterol, and higher cholesterol was used as a predictor for your risk of getting heart disease. But recently there's been a bit more controversy about the contribution of saturated dairy like butter in that risk profile. Really what we do know is that the worst fats are what are called trans fats, and they're the ones to really avoid. And they're fats that come often in the high temperature, trying to convert liquid fats to solid, and in processed food. So I think now labeling requires that companies put on products the amount of trans fat they have in them. My take is, if you have to eat something with a label like that, just avoid eating that product, because it's probably not going to be very nutritious anyway. So butter, it's a great pleasure in life. It tastes delicious. It improves the quality of the food that you're eating. You know, the recommendation is to keep it maybe about less than 10% of your calorie intake from butter. So seems like some bread and butter every day isn't going to blow your butter quota, and it's going to bring you a lot of pleasure and satisfaction. So once I put my 2 pints of organic heavy whipping cream into the mixer, I'm going to start whipping it like I'm making whipped cream. And I'm just going to leave it, and it's about 5 to 10 minutes probably in total for the transition change to fully occur. But you just leave it, and once it goes beyond whipped cream, the fat and the butter part separates out from the buttermilk. And so ultimately we're going to drain off the buttermilk and keep the butter solids for our delicious homemade butter. Okay, let the whipping begin. Cover your ears, blast off. So now you can see we've got to the point of whipped cream, but don't panic, just keep on whisking, and eventually you'll see it changing to the next stage. Now you can see here it's getting more butter-like, but it's still not whipped enough, because what's going to happen is that we're going to get a really solid fat transitioned out of the buttermilk. So suddenly you'll notice it starts splatting as the liquid really comes off. So keep going, keep going. can see that the liquid is really starting to come off from the butter. I'm going to just turn it down a bit. You can probably hear the sloshing sound. Now, before it splatters everywhere, I'm going to open this up and show you. This is ultimately going to be our butter, and in the bottom of here is the buttermilk. So now we need to drain off as much as we can of the buttermilk, and then I give it one more whisk, and then we'll move on to the next step. So once the butter starts to separate from the buttermilk, my step is to drain off some of the buttermilk using a sieve into a bowl, and then put the butter back in and give it another whisk so more of the buttermilk keeps coming off. So that's going to be my next step now. So I'm going to just drain some of this buttermilk through my sieve into a bowl, and then I'm going to give it one more whisk to really beat out some more of the buttermilk, and then we'll move on to the next phase. And one of the great things about making butter like this is that you actually get to have all of this fantastic buttermilk, which is really delicious for a variety of uses. Okay, so back on she goes for another beating. You can see at this point it gets rather splashy, but the butter really separates into a big lump, and the buttermilk just comes right off so easily. So now I think I'm going to say, before I make too much of a mess, okay, the more you beat the butter, the more buttermilk comes out. But to me that seems like some pretty nice looking butter I have there stuck inside my whisk. So I'm going to drain off this last little bit of buttermilk, hoping that the butter doesn't fall off the whisk, and then put my bowl back, and basically now I just have to just push out this butter from in the whisk back into the bowl. And the next step is the step of making the butter spreadable. And how we do that is by adding some olive oil. We add 1/4 cup of olive oil for each pint of cream that you use. So in this case I use 2 pints of cream, I use 1/2 cup of olive oil. And this is where I remove all the butter from the whisk here and transition to my beater. The reason that works to make the butter spreadable from the fridge is that olive oil doesn't set so hard at the fridge temperature as butter does. So by combining them two, you get to have straight from the fridge spreadable butter. And actually it adds a really nice little hint of grassy olive oil flavor to the butter. So now I've got most of the butter off my whisk. I just give it a final little tap on the edge of the bowl. At this point I'm going to swap out for my beater, and I'm going to add the olive oil and some salt. I'm going to add about 1/4 teaspoon of salt. It's kind of your personal preference. You can make it without any added salt. You can put in a little more salt if you like your butter a bit saltier. You can chop up some fresh rosemary and make a rosemary butter. You could put lemon zest in and make a lemon butter. Really, you can experiment with any kind of flavoring that you think might be nice in the butter. In this household, we're kind of butter traditionalists, so we just keep it with a bit of salt and just the delicious butter itself. So, my next step is I'm going to add about 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and then I'm going to put in my olive oil. So because I used 2 pints of cream, I'm doing 2 of these 1/4 cup measures of olive oil. So just pop it in. Almost done for your delicious butter to go with your delicious bread. Put my olive oil down there, take that out, I just go back to giving it a bit of a whisk up, beating the two ingredients together. Basically, I changed to using the different attachment on the KitchenAid because now I'm not concerned about getting buttermilk out of the butter. I just want to whip together the olive oil and the butter into a combined state. So that's why I just switched over to the beater. And then basically you just beat it for a couple of minutes and you'll see when it's no longer has any lumps and it's just a nice smooth butter. So once your butter, olive oil and salt have become a lovely smooth consistency, your butter is ready. And here is our fabulous, ready, whipped, delicious, homemade butter. And now the only thing left to do is use a spatula and save as much of it as you can because this stuff is amazing. And see how easy it is to make superb butter. The fat actually is makes you feel satisfied when you eat a meal. And I think one of the problems with the low fat craze was that it sort of contributed to our feeling hungry between meals and then wanting to eat more. It actually made our appetite stronger, whereas fat is very, very filling, so it's kind of almost hard to eat too much and you come away from the meal satiated, as they say. So with your delicious homemade butter you'll feel satiated. Wow, that is so beautiful. I wish that it's like the consistency of cream, but it smells so yummy and it's going to taste really good. Et voila, homemade butter, spreadable from the fridge. No additives, only its own natural antioxidants, vitamins, and delicious flavor. For the bread of our bread and butter day, I'm going to start out mixing up my flour with some whey and some buttermilk. So the bread that we're going to make today uses a very, very, very small amount of yeast to help it rise, and it also uses bacteria. I have been making yogurt, and that's going to be another another film on how to make yogurt. But one of the byproducts of yogurt is whey. Whey still contains a lot of bacteria. Those are the bacteria that actually munch down on the sugars in the milk to make the yogurt. And so these bacteria, rather like when you make sourdough bread, really enjoy also eating the starches in the flour, and as a byproduct of that they release carbon dioxide, which helps the yeast make the bread rise. This is particularly great when your goal is to make 100% whole wheat flour bread, because whole wheat has all of the fiber and wheat germ part of the grain, and that's where a lot of real nutrition is, and also fiber, which is the thing that your intestines love. But it's hard to make whole wheat bread rise and be fluffy and not too dense. But with the handy dandy help of lactobacilli, you can make really spongy, light, airy whole wheat bread. The first step in making bread, which is going to take us all day, it's a very slow food process. And even though it takes all day, we don't have to be working on it all day. We sort of do a little thing, leave it for a while, come back to it, leave it for a while. But our first step, and it's now 9:30 in the morning, is that we're going to weigh out flour. And for this bread, I'm using 100% whole grain flour. And in this bucket is a mixture of half whole wheat flour and half whole grain spelt flour, which is, spelt is another kind of wheat. And I found that this combo seems to help the bacteria and yeast create a fluffier whole grain bread that also has a really delicious wheaty flavor. So with flour, the best way to be accurate with the amount, rather than using cups to measure, is to actually measure it on the scale. So I'm going to make 1 loaf of bread, and I'm going to use 500 grams of this mixture of half whole wheat and half spelt flour. So I'm going to go up to 500 grams of flour. The other thing you can do with this bread, which I have done to great success, is you can also add pieces of walnut, you can add sesame seeds, sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds. Sometimes I put in a couple of tablespoons of just wheat germ, just to add a bit of extra wheaty flavor. So once you've got the basics down, feel free to try tasting out different delicious additives. In fact, I'm going to actually add a little bit of wheat germ. I hadn't planned to, but mentioning it just then made me realize how tasty it is. So I just put in maybe about 1/4 cup of wheat germ, or whatever other additive you might like to put in. And wheat germ is the part of the wheat where a lot of the vitamins and fat is. So it's not only a really nutty flavor, but it's probably pretty good for you too. So now I'm going to take this flour and put it into an empty container. This is a 6-quart bucket, which I found has been really helpful in making bread because it has a lid and I can just leave it to rise and leave the bacteria to work on the flour, and it's in a nice sealed container and it can rise as much as it wants and nothing's going to happen. So I just put my flour in there, and now I'm going to add liquid to the flour, and I'm going to leave it for about 2 or 3 hours. And there are 2 reasons for this. One is that the moisture and the water and the liquid helps to soften up the dry flour to make the starches in the flour more accessible for both the yeast and the bacteria to eat. And also, this gives my whey bacteria time to warm up to room temperature and to start activating and working on the bread, rather like a sourdough. So for this 500 grams of whole wheat flour, I've discovered that I need just a touch under 2 cups of liquid. So this is my whey from yogurt making, and it's a bit not quite enough. So we just made butter, and this is the buttermilk from the butter. So I'm going to top up my liquid requirements for my bread with some of this buttermilk. Buttermilk is something you can also use in many other applications in the kitchen, all sorts of baking, but also you can use it in soups and you can use it in curry or wherever you want a kind of creamy consistency and flavor. So I'm just going to fill up this up to just under 2 cups worth of liquid. So there's just about there. You might find with the particular flour you have that you need a little bit more, a little bit less. It's not massively critical, but you'll get to become familiar with the right consistency that you need for this bread making. So now I'm just going to pour this into my flour. pour it all in. And then I'm going to give it a mix. I'm going to put the lid on and I'm going to leave it to activate, start eating. So I really want to just incorporate all of the flour into the whey. It's interesting now because a lot of new research is coming out about the benefits of the bacteria that live in our gut to our health. And it's still a real new frontier in research and science. Now we've mixed together our hungry bacteria and our flour, and I'm just going to put the lid on to this and I'm going to leave it for at least a couple of hours. I'm going to go out shopping now, so I'm going to leave it till probably after lunch when we'll continue with the next steps. The optimal temperature, as I said, is about 77 degrees. So on a beautiful, warm, sunny day like today, I'm going to put the bread dough outside, and then that'll keep it just really nice and warm. And that's one of the reasons why I like these containers with a lid, because I don't have to worry that any of my neighborhood raccoons are going to get into the bread dough while it's outside warming. It's now 3 hours since we mixed together this flour and whey combo, and it's a sunny, warm day here today, so actually I put this tub outside in the warmth. So unlike most bread recipes, when you mix together the yeast, you put it in some kind of 95-degree Fahrenheit water to activate the yeast. This itself has sort of warmed up enough that we can just not worry about that part. Even if it wasn't a hot day, just leaving it in the house for a couple of hours seems to be, from my experience, enough to get it all going. So I'm going to take the lid off, and as you can see, this seems to have grown a bit since we first mixed it all up. But now the next step is that I'm going to add a teaspoonful of salt. And I just literally sprinkle it on top. Then I'm going to add the yeast, and it seems like a strange amount, but this is active dry yeast, and all I need for this recipe is 1/4 of a teaspoon of yeast plus 1/8 of a teaspoon. So I'm going to do 1/4 of this, 1/4 teaspoon, and then half of this again, and that's all the yeast I need. So just like with the salt, I just get my 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, sprinkle it on the top, and then just about 1/8 of a teaspoon, sprinkle it on the top. That's all I need. So now is the first mixing, and with this dough, it's an amazing bread recipe because you don't need to go through the whole heavy-handed kneading part of it. You just need to mix it about 3 or 4 times. Anyway, I'm going to take my ring off to do that. I've washed my hands already. I find that if my hands are wet, the dough doesn't stick so much. So I just keep a little thing of water right there, wet my hands, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold over the 4 corners of this dough. So I just put my hand in, reach down to the bottom, lift it up, fold it over. Go to the next quarter, lift it up, fold it over. I've just folded over the 4 corners of the dough. The next thing I do is take my hands like that, and like a pincer, I just divide it into 3 or 4 bits. And it all kind of melts back together. Then I put my hand in, I'm going to fold it 4 again. 1, lift up from the bottom, pull it up, fold it over, lift up from the bottom, fold it over, lift up from the bottom, fold it over. And doing this mixes the yeast and salt in with the dough, and it also helps to activate the gluten a bit, which helps the bread hold on to the air bubbles that the yeast and bacteria are going to create. It's now 10 minutes later, and we're going to do the second fold. So this is a much simpler process. All we have to do is pick up the 4 corners and fold them into the center. And again, this is just to help the gluten, which is just the proteins in the flour, to activate. One of the things I learned when learning to make bread this way from a great book called Flour, Salt, Water and Yeast is that 2 of the key ingredients are both time and temperature. So it's good to pay attention to the temperature and the time that you spend doing this. Ultimately, the optimal temperature for the bread to rise is around 75 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which is probably warmer than your average indoor room, which is why usually on a nice sunny day like this, I put the bread outside so that it gets nice and warm. Anyway, now I've just wet my hand and I'm going to do my same exact 4-fold, where I pick up one side, fold it over the top, pick up the next, fold it over, and just work my way around till I've folded over all 4 corners of the bread. In fact, this time I'm doing one more because I didn't get a bit. And that's it. Then I just put the lid on again, and now I leave it for 30 minutes. And I'm going to do 2 more folds like that. This bread dough feels lovely and warm right now, so I'm going to put it back out in the backyard to give it an optimal warmth for 30 minutes, and then we'll fold it again. We've arrived at our 3rd and final fold, and during this time, while I've been letting everything grow, I've been reading a book, I've been sitting out in the garden. So it's kind of a slow food that you can make gradually over the whole day, but you get to do other things in between. You just set yourself a timer so you remember roughly when it's time to go back and do the next fold. So again, I'm just going to wet my hand and I'm going to reach in, and oh, now my dough is starting to grow a little bit, and I'm going to pull up and fold over each one of the edges. And this is for the last time, and then I'm going to leave this outside in the nice warmth for a couple of hours before we go to the next step, which is proofing, and the proof of the bread is in the proofing. So it's now a couple of hours since the final folding of the dough, and you may be able to see that it's probably risen to about at least 3 times bigger than it was when we first mixed it. So now the next step is what's called proofing of the loaf. So what I'm going to do is tip it out of the bucket onto this board and fold it one more time, turn it over, and then put it into the bowl and leave it again for another couple of hours to proof before we finally put it in the oven. So I'm going to use some flour. You have to put some flour on your board so the dough doesn't stick, because it is quite a wet bread dough. So this time I'm using what's called teff flour, which I bought not really knowing what it was for an experiment. And it's actually made from the smallest wheat grain in the world, and it's a traditional Ethiopian flour. But one of the things is that it has no gluten, or it's very low gluten. So for those of you who want to try and avoid using gluten, maybe something worth considering. But for me, I just like it because it has a real nutty flavor, and it coats the outside of the bread with a really nice nutty crust. So first of all, because I don't want my dough to stick, I'm just going to sprinkle a load of teff flour on my board. And then this is the basket in which I'm going to allow the bread to prove. So I also want to coat the inside of this basket with flour as well. these baskets are really useful to get because they're just made of wicker. But one of the things they do is also absorb some of the moisture from the outer side of the bread dough, and that just helps to create a really nice bread crust when you go to bake it. So try to get as much of the teff flour as I can around the inside of this basket so that it hopefully won't stick. I have had the experience in the past of my bread getting a bit stuck in that basket, but it wasn't the end of the world. So I'll just move that out of the way, and now I'll see what's happened to my dough. As you can see, it's all bubbly and risen up inside the bucket. So now I'm going to just tip it out onto the board. And just, it's quite sticky, and I'll try and get the rest of it out from in there. And then basically I just do my 4 folds again. And then I flip it over, get some of the flour on my hand, and then you just pull the dough towards you across the board, and that just helps to shape the loaf. It's sticking to me a little bit now, so I'm just going to sprinkle a bit more of my teff flour on my hands to stop it from sticking. Oops. Of course, you want it to be perfect when you're on camera. Okay, so now I've kind of got a loafish-like shape. I'm going to pick it up and put it into the basket. And then I'm going to leave that for another couple of hours just to proof. It'll rise up a little bit more, and then we'll be baking. You can see here the bread in its basket has continued to rise up. I actually put it in a plastic bag, which just keeps a nice moist environment for it. The next step is going to be putting the bread in the oven, and we need to preheat the oven as well as the pot. This particular type of bread needs to be cooked inside a Dutch oven, which is a cast iron pot, and the reason for this is that the steam that is held inside the cast iron pot really helps the bread to rise, as well as the pot itself becomes really, really hot in the oven. So now I'm going to turn the oven on, and as it's preheating, it'll also be heating up this cast iron Dutch oven to the same temperature. So here goes. And then I'm going to set the oven to 475 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a very, very, very hot oven. By the time the oven has heated up, that Dutch oven inside it will also be really, really hot, and then we'll be able to put the bread in and cook. I just wanted to quickly go over again the ingredients for the bread that we've made today. The bread is 500 grams of whole wheat flour, and you can use any kind of whole wheat. I use half whole wheat, half whole spelt flour. It has a teaspoon of salt, a quarter and an eighth of a teaspoon of yeast. It had just under 2 cups of whey and buttermilk. You could use water instead, and if you used water, then I would use warm water at about 95 degrees Fahrenheit to mix. That's it. Flour, salt, water and yeast. Okay, now my oven has just beeped to tell me it's got to 475 Fahrenheit, so I'm going to just put a little more flour on my board because I'm going to tip out my loaf and then take out the very hot pan and transfer it and put it in the oven. So let's see, hopefully this is a kind of amazingly risen piece of bread, bread dough. But my trick is now that I'm going to have to tip it out of this wicker basket. So I think actually it seems as though it's not really stuck, so I'm going to hope that it isn't and leave it there for a second. Then I'm going to get my very hot pan out and put it here and then do a quick flip. So I'm going to have to be pretty speedy at that point. Okay, here goes. Here's my very, very, very hot pan. I'll shut the oven door so it stays hot. Take the lid off. This is where you have to be very careful not to burn yourself. I'm going to tip out my loaf. Woohoo! That's definitely didn't stick. I've just got to try and corral this liquid loaf and put it in there. Then I put the lid back on and then put it back in the oven. And then I'm going to set the timer for 30 minutes with the lid on. And then when the oven beeps after 30 minutes, just take the lid off and let it stay in there for about another 20 to 25 minutes to get a really nice crispy crust on the loaf. It's now 30 minutes in and I've just taken the lid off and set the timer for another 20 minutes. You may need to give it a couple more minutes depending on how brown and cooked you like the crust, but just got 20 minutes to go now and our loaf will be ready. Yay, the bread is ready, the bread is ready. So, actually I'll turn the oven off because it's really hot. Here we go. Wow, there we are. I can tip it right out of its thing. Ta-da! Whole wheat bread. This was a kind of slow bread because it took all day, but it didn't really take all day because I did lots of other things during the day, lay around and read a book and talked to people on the phone and things like that. But because it took all day and it took a lot of love and it gave me a lot of pleasure, I really appreciate this loaf, and I'm sure that the two of us here will eat this over the week and we won't waste any of it because we really value it. But unfortunately, it's estimated that about 40% of the food produced in America is just wasted. And that's bad because wasting food means that the fossil fuels that were used to produce it, the land that was used to produce it, the water that was used to produce it is kind of wasted. So it's something to think about, and if you want to know more, then please watch our new documentary called The Root Cause, which will tell you a lot of information about the different ways that human activities impact on the planet. And of course, maybe I should get the butter out of the fridge. Here's the bread, and here is the homemade butter. If I can get the lid off. Homemade whole wheat bread, homemade organic butter.